Born in Hungary in 1882, Bela Bashko would adopt Lugosi as his last and stage name during his teenage years. As a young man, he became a political unionist, but by the right-wing party he had to flee the country, first fleeing off to Germany and then making a movie career in the ever-so-booming region in America, Los Angeles. In the silent age of movies, he did moderately well, but there were definitely concerns on how his native Hungarian accent would affect his flow of sound movies, but Universal were working on a feature where the role was just perfect for Lugosi. Released in February of '31, that year Dracula had earned Universal half their earnings. By April, they were already working on the next horror project, Frankenstein. Inviting Lugosi for a small bit of test footage for the starring role, Bela was delightful for getting the role of Dr. Frankenstein. That was until the studio explained that they had him in mind for the role of Dr. Frankenstein's creation. Lugosi had his own idea for the makeup of the creature, which was rejected. Lugosi grew ever more uncomfortable on the role, learning about Jack Pierce's lengthy makeup process for the monster. A screen test was devised, with a leftover set from Dracula. Lugosi in the monster makeup was laid down and dormant, alongside Dr. Woolman, played by Edwin Van Sloan, who had previously played Van Helsing in Dracula, and the hunchback assistant Fritz, played by Dwight Fry, who had additionally appeared in Dracula. Both actors respectively played their new characters in the final film, with an unknown actor playing Henry Frankenstein in the test. The sequence shows the monster slowly opening his eyes. But if one had to be honest, Lugosi wasn't entirely thrilled about the project. He saw himself as a leading man, and really wanted roles that better reflected himself. But he would have reluctantly took on the part. But that was until James Whale was brought on to direct the piece, and recommended the lesser known but more obedient actor Boris Karloff. Later released in November of that same year, Karloff through his commitment to Frankenstein, it allowed him to get later work on other Universal projects. Post 1931, if Karloff was an A-list actor, Lugosi was a B-list one. Money was tight, so he couldn't object to any role. Both actors starred alongside one another in several projects. While they were never really friends, Lugosi would always heroically retell that Frankenstein story, claiming that he personally turned down the role, allowing Karloff to ascend as a Hollywood star. 7 years later, after Frankenstein and Dracula, Karloff was still hammering the rewards. But as for Lugosi, in the last 2 of those 7 years, he only appeared in 1 film, and when his son was born, he lost his house. For anybody in that low state reflecting back, one can't help but wonder on the what if. If he just begrudgingly went through playing the monster, could things be any different? This is the story on how Lugosi got a second chance playing the Frankenstein monster, but unfortunately, it would truly be the beginning of the end for his acting career. To get some missing media found, be sure to spread the word. And if you're a new viewer, don't forget to subscribe so I can keep on making these documentaries. 1935, the anticipated sequel Bride of Frankenstein was released, with Karloff reprising back into the monster makeup, literally starting where the last film ended off. The monster's character is elevated in the sequel. Lonely and lost, he desires companionship. The sequel was just as equally as matched as its prior film, perhaps maybe more so. As the film is generally considered to be the best of the black and white Universal classic horrors. The following year, Dracula got its sequel, Dracula's Daughter, the titled character, Countess Maria. Similar to Bride of Frankenstein, it follows a monster longing to be free from her bearings. Although unlike its Frankenstein counterpart, it features no return of Bela Lugosi as Dracula, and its reception and legacy is not as nearly as highly regarded as Bride. Universal saw it appropriate to put their horror series on hiatus, which wouldn't last long, as in 1938, Dracula and Frankenstein were reissued, home media still being decades away. It gave the opportunity for the public to revisit these flicks, and most likely for many of them, they never had the chance to see Frankenstein or Dracula. The box office earnings for the re-release, Universal saw it appropriate to get to work on the next Frankenstein film, Karloff returning for a third time in a row, and uniting him with his horror co-star, Bela Lugosi as Igor. With the last Frankenstein film being released 4 years prior, the continuity was mostly disregarded. The third film, Son of Frankenstein, plays around with Igor's connection with the monster, despite not being in the prior films. It sets up the relationship of the monster being obedient to Igor. This does sadly drop the character growth from the monster in the last movie, taking a back seat and being a plot device, with Igor really being the main secondary star, while the monster is the only true returning character, and essentially rebooting his personality, but it retains the continuity of quality with its characters and storyline, making the film just as good in its own right, where typically most film series would start going down at this point. In fact, the scale of the film is much more grander. Made at the peak of the golden age of Hollywood, as the profits increase, so did the budgets. Most of the Frankenstein films usually clock in at just over an hour. Son of Frankenstein is just shy of an hour and 40 minutes. The budget was going to extend as far as to photograph the movie in colour. During production, still only under 10 movies were photographed in Technicolor. Amongst the early days of principal photography, Jack Pierce felt that he couldn't get the monster's makeup to look right in colour. So very quickly they reverted back to black and white. It's not officially known as to how much was photographed in colour, but aside the test footage with Boris Karloff, what was filmed has never again since resurfaced. Even though Universal had the funds to completely refilm the movie, it was quite clear that they had favourites when it came to the compensation with their actors. For a week's work, Karloff was paid $3,750. Lugosi was only rewarded with $500, being required on set for only 1 week. Lugosi was desperate for money, so he couldn't dare turn down the offer. Director Roland Lee was disgusted by the studio's behaviour. Coming to Lugosi's aid, he kept him on set for the whole shoot, earning about 8 times his original payment. Igor is generally considered to be one of his best roles. Some even say that it surpasses his performance as Dracula. After Son, Lugosi was within a new 5-year contract with Universal. Son of Frankenstein was certainly successful on its release, but the following horror films would be downgraded to B picture quality, being made cheaper with less resources. Son of Frankenstein would be the last A picture of the series. Universal's previous horror stars were reaching a senior age. Now, not to say somebody in their 50s and 60s can't play a monster, but given the type of physical demands that many of these monsters and ghouls would get up to in these flicks, Universal needed to find somebody slightly younger to keep up with the physical demands. But who would that be? Born in February of 1906, Creighton Toole Chaney, who was the son of acclaimed character actor Lon Chaney. Their relationship was strained to say the least. His parents were divorced at the age of 7, and his father told him for years that his mum was long gone, only to find out as a young man that his mum was alive and well. Chaney additionally dabbled in his son's career choice. The young man Creighton had aspirations of following within his father's footsteps of becoming an actor, but his father swiftly put him on an education system for engineering. Lon Chaney struggling for many years during his acting career, wishing for his son to not go through the same experience, heavily discouraging him on the acting path. By consequence, the following years after his death in 1930, his son would have a love-hate reflection back on his dad. On one hand, he could admire him as an actor, the poses, the expression, and his utilities with his makeup skills, but he could never truly rationalize or even forgive him as a parent. By the peak of the Great Depression, Creighton's life was in deeply disrepair. His plumbing business failed along with his marriage, and with 2 young boys to feed, and his grades and CV were not at all great, with limited opportunities. It was desperate times for Creighton. With Lon Chaney dead and out of the picture, Disobeying his father's warnings, he went straight into the movie business. For years, he was able to scramble together some small bit parts. The money was just barely enough to get on by. While extremely reluctant, by the persuasion of many producers, Creighton Toll Chaney went by the stage name Lon Chaney Jr. in the hope that it may pique interest. But even within the shadow of his father, it caused hardly a dent in his career. For the few that did know him in Hollywood, he was a joke. He went to drama school during the mid-30s to improve on his acting skills, but after a few sessions the coach said that Chaney was good enough to teach half the class. Chaney Jr. would try his luck yet again, but this time on stage, getting a leading role for the theatre performance of Mice and Men, playing the part of Lenny. Hal Roach brought the screen rights to adapt the book for a movie, and Chaney Jr. was desperate to get the role, but with no agent he had to essentially beg for the part that was already taken by another actor. A compromise was made, with Lon Chaney doing many screen tests, with the other actors standing in as Lenny. He was promised that he would get his own screen test for the role, but before that would happen, the director was impressed enough that he hired him on board. He essentially fitted the character, as both Lenny and Chaney were similar. Both were seemingly big brutes, a little bit thick, but could have a heart of gold. This movie would help to put Chaney on the Hollywood radar. Unfortunately, throughout the rest of his career, he would be rather typecast as the Lenny-like role. But what was important to Chaney was that work was flowing in. And that new work would come in the form of a contract with Universal. Chaney would be their go-to robust monster, getting a chance to play all 4 classic Universal monsters: the Frankenstein creation, the Mummy, and Dracula, regardless if he was an obvious choice or not. What perhaps made Chaney more desirable as a big star during the 40s was, unlike Karloff and Lugosi, where the attitudes at the time, they looked and sounded foreign to a US audience. Lon Chaney Jr. looked like and sounded like your everyday American, and that was something that the US public needed during the time of the Second World War, to see an underdog American pull through. He may have been the only actor to play all the Universal monsters during the golden age of Hollywood, but there's certainly one monster he can call his own, and is still best remembered for to this day. Which, of course, obvious to monster fans, was Larry Talbot, Kurz as the Wolfman. This wasn't Universal's first werewolf movie. There were 2 prior attempts. There was a storyline script written, tailor-made for Boris Karloff. The working title was the same as The Wolfman, but aside from sharing the same name, both plots were completely different, being instead about a boy raised by wolves. Once rescued, he's transformed into a werewolf. But Universal deemed the rest of the storyline too taboo for religious groups. Then there was Werewolf of London that was actually produced. Several scenes such as the werewolf transformation were tiptoe around on screen. This was because Universal were fearful that such a transformation on film would be too extreme for audiences. Jack Pierce did have a much more lengthy makeup process in mind, but the main star of the picture, Henry Hull, was very involved in the discussion of the makeup, feeling that it would be best for the audiences to recognise his face under the beastly mask. But Jack Pierce's design would eventually come to fruition in the 1941 Wolfman. Being the ultimate werewolf film for Universal, the film was additionally the foundation for the idea of the modern werewolf, for as the man that was responsible for making the ultimate choices for the werewolf mythology was writer Kurt Seelmark, a German sci-fi author and scriptwriter, immigrating to America just prior to the rise of the Nazis, intensely researching into the werewolf mythology, but not being satisfied with the folktales. He did his own interpretation for the Wolfman, introducing the rules that an individual can be cursed with a werewolf bite, and silver can be either repellent or even kill off such a beast. All of these tropes related to werewolves originated with this movie. The film was meant to be much more analytical, and the transformation scenes would have been merely implied, being left up to interpretation if Larry was truly a werewolf. But higher-ups knew that the general audience would much rather prefer a straight werewolf film, so in the final script and movie, nothing was left up to the imagination.
Go now, and heaven help you.
But a bit of trivia, and for lost media enthusiasts, what was left out was a fight scene between Larry Talbot and a bear, with his animalistic personality bleeding through, clashing with his morality. Although Larry brutally defeating the bear didn't go down well with test audiences, so it was removed for that reason. One single shot from the sequence was used in the trailer, but as to what happened to the original footage is completely unknown. While Lon Chaney very much appreciated the Wolfman role being his own, he was not exactly comfortable within the Wolfman makeup. The yak hair that was applied was itchy, but he couldn't dare touch his face, or else he would risk spoiling the makeup. The process could take up to 6 hours to merely apply, and still a grueling 3 hours just to take off. At one point confronting the scriptwriter Sealmark, in his utter frustration.
He was sitting on horrible looking on a little table by himself, and he glowered at me and wanted to kill me. And I said, don't kill a poor writer who just gets his job. Why don't you kill Jack Pierce, who made you into a wolfman? Leave me alone, right?
Universal were on a roll with their B-graded horror pictures, as their next one would be released only 3 months later, Ghost of Frankenstein, the 4th installment of the series. Showing the same cast and crew from the Wolfman, this Frankenstein film yet again deviates from its predecessor. Igor is miraculously alive and well, being played yet again by Bela Lugosi, never really explaining on how he survived from the last film, although one senior member that hadn't returned was Boris Karloff. Turning 51 years in age in the prior film, he had no aspiration for reprising as the monster. Being the first Frankenstein without Karloff, Chaney Jr. took on the role for the monster. It seemed a fitting casting choice, as Chaney was famous for his Lenny role, and just like Lenny, the monster is a brute and social outcast, but is really and truly morally innocent like a child. Chaney Jr.'s performance as the monster is, well, rather lifeless, lacking the prior innocence of Karloff. The monster's character growth may have backtracked, but an element that was expanded upon from the original film was the monster's relationship with a small girl. In the original, it was merely just a tantalizing glimpse, resulting in an accident that downfall the monster. In Ghost of Frankenstein, a subplot develops of the monster befriending a small girl called Kirstein. The young actress, Janet Angelo, developed a real friendship with Chaney. Unfortunately, during filming, her mother passed away. Lon Chaney, being the real-life Lenny, confronted her father, inquiring about adopting her and her younger brother. The father politely declined, but it certainly melted Janet's heart on the empathetic nature of Chaney. The main meat of the plot, Igor and the monster, head off to try and find Frankenstein's other son, Liquid Frankenstein, to see if he can make the monster any stronger. Initially he declines, but through the spirit of his father, he encourages him to give the monster a new brain, which will hopefully result in the monster having a new and better conscience. Igor has other ideas. Fed up of his old frail body, he teams up with the other doctor, Boomer, to transplant Igor's brain into the monster.
I am Igor. I've created 100 times the monster that my father made.
The plan, however, majorly backfires.
I can't see! Where are you?
Because both of the biology between Igor and the monster were not compatible, it renders Igor yet again being disabled.
Over! You played me a trick! What good is a brain without eyes?
Through Igor's rage, it eventually leads to a domino effect, with the house up in flames. Interestingly enough, a promotional picture from Ghost of Frankenstein depicts the monster fleeing the house, and in a 1959 episode of The Steve Allen Show, shows a brief clip of the monster in flames, seemingly from the promotional image. But the monster escaping in the burning building is nowhere to be seen in the shooting script. A more likely explanation was that this was just a big promotional photo shoot on the night that they were photographing the burning building of the huge miniature of Frankenstein's house. For such an expensive shot, Universal wanted to get their money's worth. It may be a subpar sequel compared to its prior films, but it ultimately acts as the grand finale for the Frankenstein series. No matter which way you look at it, the monster that we come to know and love has been practically killed off. Igor has been made incapable of fulfilling his evil scheme. Both Igor and the monster have been united and at the same time been destroyed. But of course, that wasn't going to stop Universal from pursuing any more sequels. This film was still a smash hit at the box office. For anybody that was thinking that there was nothing else the series could do that was new and original, well, Universal were going to do something completely different that had never been done before in film. The Cinematic Universe, a concept where 2 or more movies may share their continuity and even overlaps with one another. with superhero fans being so spoilt during the 2010s with the abundance of DC flicks and Marvel movies, but it would be Universal 70 plus years earlier that would first attempt a crossover film. But to be honest, their seed of the idea started as an utter joke. The year was 1942. Kurt Seelmark had bought a convertible off one of his writer friends, but he drained his money from the bank to do so. Fortunately, he was working with George Wagner at the time, who had directed and produced The Wolfman. He promised Kurt that he would give him a writing gig to pay off the car. Well, just prior to the car incident, the two men were having a conversation, and Kurt made the joke. "George, why don't we make a picture? Frankenstein Wolf the Meat Man. Frankenstein meets the Wolfman." George didn't find the joke that amusing. A short time later, after Kirk's purchasing of the car, Wagner gave an assignment to Seelmark to turn his bad joke into a script within the span of only 2 hours. He stamped on the idea of the aspirations of the main characters. Both of their wants and desires are polar opposites. The monster craves life and wishes to be brought back to full power, while Larry, cursed to be the werewolf, seeks out to end his suffering, where death seems to be the only place he can find it.
He wants to die, but he cannot die. He knows he cannot die, so he is looking for the man who knows the secret of life and death.
While they both have different goals, what they have in common is that they need to constantly flee from society. Thus, they need to rely on one another to succeed on their end goals. Story construction, that was why I was paid in every damn country. I could conduct a story out of the blue sky. Most writers are dialogue writers, and they produce very worthy dialogue. But there are really few constructionists who start from scratch. That's how I got jobs. Despite the script's quick deadline, the movie wouldn't see development not for another 6 months. The marketing retained the joke title, blatantly referring to the monster as Frankenstein, even though he's never called Frankenstein once in the film, a well-known misconception that continues on to this day. Lon Chaney was set to reprise both Larry Talbot and the monster by the aid of body doubles to achieve the illusion, but very close to the first day of filming, Lon Chaney pleaded to only play the Wolfman, as he increasingly became distressed on the lengthy makeup process. Chaney in makeup was becoming problematic, starting on his prior film, The Mummy's Tomb, where, let's say, despite being known as the gentle chap, you wouldn't like to be there when he snapped. By the recollection of Ilona Massey, who played Elsa Frankenstein in the story, Chaney was on his best behaviour during the shooting of the film, which in this installment they got much more ambitious with the werewolf effects, as this is the first time we get to see a straight transformation from Larry, tediously filming one shot for many hours, applying the makeup bit by bit while Chaney had to remain completely still.
The day we did the transformations, I came in at 2 a.m. When I hit that position, they would take little nails and drive them through the skin at the end of my fingers on both hands so that I wouldn't move them anymore.
God, no wonder why he didn't want to play Frankie. But with the filming date only around the corner, who would play the Frankenstein monster? Screenwriter Seelmark approached Boris Karloff, but Karloff declined, not wishing to reprise the monster yet again. But Seelmark had another good horror friend, Bela Lugosi. Lugosi would always try to get Seelmark into one of his next projects. Well, the monster role was certainly open, which Lugosi just narrowly missed out on all those years ago. His wife Lillian would always say, creating his own monster. And then in 1942, Hollywood history wickedly repeated itself. His motivation for doing the role was money, finally sacrificing his reserved nature. But in the continuity of the films, it did make sense, being a straight sequel of not only The Wolfman, but Ghost of Frankenstein. Igor, played by Bela Lugosi, his brain was transferred into the monster's body, with Lugosi's voice being dubbed straight onto the monster. So it makes sense that Igor, or Bela, takes over the monster's body. Despite being promoted as the Battle of the Century, and both essentially being the main characters, Lugosi and Chaney were only given second billing. With a budget of $300,000, production officially started on October 12, 1942, of Hollywood's first crossover and monster mash movie. Turning 60 years of age during production, unfortunately it was becoming clear that Bela was just not suitable for playing the monster at his age. It took 4 hours to apply the makeup, and a grueling 16 hours to remain in it. To prepare himself in the role every day, Bela would get up at 2:30 in the morning, and would bathe in a hot tub to prepare himself. There was an unfortunate incident on set. Exhausted, Lugosi collapsed. The crew knew that he wasn't going to be able to do the more physically demanding scenes, such as the fight sequence with the werewolf at the end. Stuntman Eddie Parker, who had previously doubled for Chaney in Ghost of Frankenstein and would do so again in The Mummy's Ghost. In Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, he would stand off stage in the monster makeup, ready to take over if there was a scene too tiring for Lugosi. Director of the film, Roy William Neal, much preferred Eddie in the makeup as he looked far more striking, using him specifically in the monster's first scene. The situation was certainly embarrassing for Lugosi, but he was definitely relieved that he didn't have to be behind the ice wall. During the production of this movie, he was part of the group, the American-Hungarian Defense Federation in Los Angeles. With a group comprising of 10,000 individuals, they were able to raise $1,600 for the Red Cross. Near to the end of filming, both Lon Chaney and Maria Upsinskaya were shooting the carriage scenes when the cart accidentally turned too quickly, pinning both actors underneath. Chaney garnered some deep cuts but was able to resume filming. Maria was rushed to hospital and she was unable to film her final scenes, hence why she's absent during the climax of the film. Filming was concluded on the 11th of November. Okay, so production was a little bit patchy, a little bit hasty here and there, but none of that mattered now. Universal had a very unique sequel on their hands, a film unlike any other that was made thus far. All they had to do now was just see on how people generally warmed to it. And that's where things started going downhill. The movie was shortly screen test before release. The test audience responded well to the picture. That wasn't until after the monster's introduction, the audience laughed at the monster having a seemingly foreign accent. Do you know why they took the monster's dialogue away? Because Bela Lugosi couldn't talk. They had left the dialogue I wrote for the monster in the picture when they shot it, but with Lugosi sounding so Hungarian, funny when they took it out, seriously. Lugosi was good with Dracula because it supplied him with a Hungarian part, but a monster with a Hungarian accent? Producers pitching the movie as a grand battle, the screen test made them extremely fearful that people wouldn't take the film as seriously. Scenes with the monster talking was exiled out, or for some shots the monster was muted. Just like the ending of the previous film, the monster was meant to be blind. Lugosi reflected this in his performance.
No, it's me.
But with the dialogue removed, it makes his performance seem more awkward. Alas, despite the film's more recent reviews, when it was first previewed in February of 1943, the press responded positively, unaware of the movie's last-minute hasty edit. This would be the last time Lugosi would be in the straight horror films of Universal. With other actors fulfilling the Dracula role in the final films, this severely crushed Lugosi. So, what was the original cut like? Well, the original shooting script has been circulating around the horror fan community for quite some time now. So I think we can have a little glimpse to see on what the original version could have been like. Taking place 4 years after the events of the Wolfman, grave robbers break in to the burial place of Larry and his family. Unfortunately for the grave robbers, the night they choose was the night of a full moon, and the exposure to the light of Larry's corpse is not only enough to resurrect Larry, but to awaken the beast within him. A short time later, Larry is rediscovered unconscious on the streets of Cardiff and is immediately brought to Queen's Hospital. The mention of Cardiff is the only confirmation we ever get in these movies that the Wolfman did indeed come from Wales. Which, I don't live too far away from Cardiff. That little fact always brings a grin to me and my family, that one of these flicks takes place so nearby home. Anyway, back to the plot. Dr. Frank Mannering, after confirming Larry's name and place of origin, is somewhat baffled after he finds out through the authorities that he's been dead for several years. Staying at the hospital for the past month, Larry is unfortunate to go through another full moon, murdering a police officer that night. Upon waking up, he becomes deeply disturbed on what he possibly could have done. and his fears are confirmed once he learns about the murder supposedly done by some wild animal.
Oh, are you blind? Won't you believe me? Help me.
Failing to convince Dr. Mannering or anybody else upon his werewolf curse, he goes on a search and finally reunites with Maliva, the gypsy lady from the prior film, in the hope that she may be able to help him in some form. Larry concludes that the only way to truly stop the werewolf curse is by that of suicide. But of course he needs to be dead permanently, while Maliva knows a man that may be able to help him. That of course is Dr. Frankenstein. Unfortunately, upon arrival to his home village, Frankenstein is not only a taboo subject, but died many years ago when his home went up in flames. Larry doesn't take the news inherently well. That night a full moon comes yet again, transforming into the werewolf, wreaking havoc across the village. Notably, it looks like the bartender from earlier is carrying a deceased family member. Keep that in mind for later. The people of the town take no caution and immediately hunts out the elusive creature. Larry is chased and soon falls into an ice cavern. Fortunately, the village people are unable to trace him any further. A short time later, when the Wolfman reverts back to Larry, he discovers the famed Frankenstein monster embedded in the ice, being able to break him free.
Where are you? I can hardly see.
Watch out. You'll burn yourself.
Burn myself. Help me get up.
How did you get here?
The village people wanted to kill me. They burned the house down. Dr. Frankenstein died before my eyes. I ran, my clothes afire, down into the cellar, toward the ice house, where I could be safe. But I fell into the mainstream. I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was frozen in that block of ice. Conscious for years, but unable to move.
Buried alive. I know.
Yes, buried alive. Until you found me. Who are you?
My name's Lawrence Talbot.
What are you doing here?
I'm hiding. Same as you.
Those futile little mortals. And you hate them too?
Yes.
Then you are my friend. I need friends. So do you. We can help each other.
How will we get out of here?
The laboratory must be behind the ice.
Climbing out the ice cavern, they emerge into Frankenstein's laboratory, where they continue on with their conversation.
Dr. Frankenstein created this body to be immortal. His son gave me a new brain. A clever brain. I will use it for the benefit of the miserable people who inhabit the world. I will rule the world. I would live to witness the fruit of my wisdom for all eternity.
But if you grew tired of living, if the light of day and the dark of night became unbearable to you, would you still cling to this earth for centuries without the hope of finding peace? What if you wanted to die?
I never think of death. I want to get strong and well. The story of my creation is written down in Dr. Frankenstein's diary. He knew the secret of immortality, and he knew the secret of death.
The secret of death? He knew it? I've got to have the book. Where is it?
You? Why should you have it?
The diary might make you strong again and give your eyesight back, and it could help me. You said I was your friend. Who else will help you if I don't?
How do I know you won't trick me?
You've got to trust me. The diary will tell how to cure you, how to give you back your strength, your eyesight. You're weak. You couldn't defend yourself if the people from this area attacked you again.
They can't kill me.
But if they catch you, chain you, and bury you alive, 6 feet under with tons of earth on your body, where would your powers be then?
Being able to persuade the monster, they go in search for the diary.
It's here. Wait. Don't leave me. Wait. I was afraid you ran away.
It's not here.
It's gone?
The diary, are you sure this is where he kept it?
Yes. It was a book with a brass clasp.
It's not here.
It can't be.
The fire must have destroyed it.
It must not be.
To my loving father, Elsa. Elsa?
Frankenstein's daughter.
Did she die in the fire?
No, I remember she escaped. She must still be alive.
Then she must know where her father kept it. Then she's the one that can tell me.
However, Elsa Frankenstein claims to Larry that she doesn't have any documentations, nor does she wish to get wrapped up in her family escapades. That evening, Larry gets invited to the village fair. There he's reunited with Dr. Mannering, who was able to track down Larry. Now fully believing his story, he offers Larry his help, but Larry is still convinced that the only way to end his curse is by that of death. Before anything is truly resolved, the monster emerges into the village. Larry comes to the monster's aid, both escaping back up to the ruined castle, but this only makes Larry look ever more suspicious to the village townfolks, which surely soon they'll be chasing back after the monster and himself.
Why did you come down to the village? Now they will hunt us again.
I was afraid you left me. I thought you found the diary and run away.
You think you're clever? Frankenstein gave you a cunning brain, did he? But you're dumb. You ruined our only chance.
Talbot! Talbot!
Don't leave me. Don't go. I'm weak. They'll catch me and bury me alive.
Talbot, where are you?
Put out the fire. The smoke will give us away.
The party who is searching for Larry and the monster is Maliva, Elsa, and Dr. Frank, who wish to help Larry by aiding with his wishes of assistant suicide.
Steady. They're friends.
Oh, it's you.
This is Dr. Mannering. He's here to make you well.
To make me well? It's my eyes. I can barely see.
Elsa secretly knew as to where her father's diary was all this time. After fixing up the machines, it's planned that they will drain both Larry and the monster's energy, permanently killing them off once and for all.
When you were talking to the monster, I was afraid you meant what you said.
What did I say?
You said you'd help him.
Of course I can.
Dr. Frank is just hastily able to start the process just on the evening of the full moon, but at the last minute, he becomes obsessed seeing the monster at full strength.
My sight is back.
Unfortunately for him, the monster becomes loose. All of this happens right when the full moon comes into view, which of course now unleashes the Wolfman. The two monstrous brutes start fighting, allowing a diversion long enough for everybody to escape the ruins. Meanwhile, the bartender early in the film, Varzek, overhearing the conversation with Larry and Frankenstein, he takes action in his own hands, blowing up the dam, which will in turn destroy and wash away the last of the ruins, which both the Frankenstein monster and the Wolfman get caught up in. This concludes the story. When the film was re-edited and restructured to remove the monster's dialogue, they of course not only deleted the discussion scenes with the monster, but wherever possible, they just simply muted the monster's dialogue out. Most clear in the sequence where Larry and the monster are trying to find the diary, you can make out the monster's lips moving to retain the essential information for the audience. They got Lon Chaney to dub in a few lines.
Dr. Frankenstein must have kept records. A diary. You know where it is. Show me.
They additionally did a pickup shot with Chaney as well.
What was that?
The ice melting. The water will be rushing down soon. And turning the turbines, the machines will work again.
That's the water. The water rushing down to turn the turbines. That'll make the machines work.
The resurgence of the horror genre would last throughout World War II, but post-war, Universal would merge with another company, becoming Universal International. A change of management would see a cease in production of the B-movie catalogue. In the final straight horror of the series, House of Dracula, the fourth movie to feature Larry Talbot, and the third of the crossover films would see only the Wolfman having a sincere happy ending, finally being cured of his werewolf curse. But as for the Frankenstein creation and Dracula, who at this point had largely taken a back seat to Larry in the series, would be killed off indefinitely. But technically, there would be one final movie with the classic monsters. In the 1948 comedy Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein, it was a Broadway script idea for many years, before being picked up by producer Robert Arthur. Despite being a spoof of the genre, the film saw continuity, with the horror actors respectively reprising their roles. Glenn Strange came back as the Frankenstein creation for the third time in a row, amusingly being nicknamed Frankie in the film.
Frankie, don't let him do it to you. Frankie boy. Listen to me, Frankie.
The closest he was ever called Frankenstein in the original Universal flicks. And of course, Lon Chaney as the Wolfman, and Vincent Price makes a small cameo by the end of the film.
Oh, that's too bad. I was hoping to get in on the excitement.
Who said that?
Allow me to introduce myself. I'm the Invisible Man.
Who played the man himself in the sequel The Invisible Man Returns. But the role of Dracula didn't seem so obvious. Ian Keefe was selected for the part. He was actually up for consideration of playing Dracula back in the 31 classic, but a senior head intervened to instead cast Lugosi in the role. He hadn't appeared in a Universal catalogue movie, not since Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, and while he did play various vampires on film, and Dracula countless times on stage, this would be the first and final time Bela Lugosi would come back playing Dracula in the movies. While off camera, he certainly had fun with the production, as long as he wasn't involved with the pie fight affairs. But on set, despite being a comedy, Lugosi took the film very seriously. The film has a surviving blooper reel, something extremely rare and unusual to make during this time in filmmaking.
I can't help it.
There was an infamous take where the clown of the set, Bobby Barber, walks in during Lugosi's take. His job on the Abbott and Costello films was to keep things light-hearted on set, but Lugosi was far from appreciative.
A person could get killed that way.
Privately, he was dealing with an addiction of morphine that he had started some years earlier. Lon Chaney Jr. as equally suffered in private. It was no secret to anybody on set that he had a serious drinking problem. The pressure of his father's legacy, and exhausted of playing the Wolfman. Only a month after Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein wrapped up filming, he attempted to take his own life. Thankfully, Chaney did survive, and this production would be far from his last, but the road for him and Lugosi to the very end wasn't an easy one. Lugosi hoped that after being with Abbott and Costello, it would open up the prospect for more comedy films. But for the remainder of his life, he only got 6 more movie gigs, forming a close friendship with the flawed filmmaker Ed Wood. Bela would pass away in 1956. Lugosi would never get to see the resurgence of his films. But Chaney Jr. would get that luxury. He got to live and cross over with that first generation of filmmakers that were inspired of the black and white classics. He was still working during his late life, from guest roles that harken back to his iconic monster, to starring roles in B-graded pictures. Regardless of the quality, Lon Chaney carried on working. But by the end, his health continuously degraded. He was still working, but they would only be in the form of small bit parts. His final movie would be the flawed but cult film Dracula vs. Frankenstein, merely playing a brute mute, murdering and supplying body parts for Dr. Frankenstein. If he seems frail in that film, that was because he was growing sicker near to the end of his life. Sure, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman was no masterpiece to begin with, but Dracula vs. Frankenstein is a far cry from its standards. But if it at least demonstrated one thing, it was that Chaney Jr. was dedicated to the horror genre right to the end. His true standout role during his twilight years, a personal favourite with him and his family, was starring as the dad in the TV series The Golden Junk Man, about a poorly educated Italian immigrant that works hard to make ends meet, saving up the money so his kids can have a better education.
I bought you these wonderful books so that you will not grow up so ignorant as Papa.
Getting a chance to play the romanticised father he always wished he had, one that would have encouraged to follow his dreams and aspiration.
They can't take me away from you, Bruno. You won't let them, will you, Bruno?
I promised your daddy I wouldn't.
I knew you wouldn't, Bruno. I'm not afraid.
In 1986, the film got its VHS debut. It immediately sold out in every New York store. The sales piqued interest for the elusive original cut. By the late 80s, the MCA Video, responsible for restoring many Universal titles, began a search for the original cut. But over 35 years on, their search is still in vain. The film was produced in the heart of World War II, many decades before the concept of DVD extras. Judging by the fate of other deleted scenes from the same time, it's more than likely that they were permanently disposed of many years before piqued interest or deleted scenes offered any viable use. It's very rare for any alternative cut to a movie this old survive to this day. The original 2.5-hour cut of Metropolis was a miracle of a rediscovery. Finds like those happened few and far in between. Was the original cut any better than the end product? Was there something Lugosi brought to the role that could have made the monster as equally engaging as Karloff? Or, just like in the final film, was the original character just so distorted from the amount of sequels that he would have been in the shadows of Larry Talbot, as further sequels would focus on his storyline? After all, it seemed like that everything was explored with the monster in the prior films, and there wasn't as much exploration for Larry's character at this point in the series, so it seemed like a natural direction to go in. Granted, we still have the original script. You can always try and interpret as to what they were going for, but seeing the original execution, that is an entirely different thing. We'll perhaps never get the luxury to see the original, but hey, it's always fun to speculate.